Hello, welcome back to the Space Gulag, otherwise known as PPSW, your favorite hangout place. Today we're back with another Star Wars story. Today we're going to discover what would have happened had Finn been the Jedi of the sequel trilogy. Before we begin this video, special thanks to our patrons, voice actors, and everyone else part of the Pente Patrol team. If you want a chance to win in our next giveaway, watch to the end of the video and I will tell you exactly how you can win. Our story begins on Starkiller Base in the year of 34 ABY. The planet Starkiller Base was originally built onto the ancient Jedi world of Ilum. As a means to erase the Jedi from all existence, the Empire began deconstructing the planet, though it was the First Order that finished the plans of the fallen Empire and the failed Imperial remnant. Ilum was always cold, and there was never really a time where the ice world was warm. Finn and Rey had just watched Kylo Ren kill their new friend Han Solo. He was a legendary smuggler, and after that, became the renowned hero of the rebellion. Though he was gone, and Finn and Rey needed to find their way off of Starkiller Base. The Resistance was here, and they were going to destroy the entire planet. They had to. The First Order had just destroyed the Hosnian system, where the New Republic capital was. As Finn and Rey ran through the forest, they heard the ignition of Kylo's lightsaber. Their fear heightened. Only one of them had a lightsaber, and while Finn had First Order trading, and Rey had plenty of experience with the staff, neither one of them were ready to take on a former Jedi that was able to kill an entire order of Jedi and steal its best students. Kylo was getting stronger and stronger by the day, though the two escapees had one benefit. Kylo was shot by a crossbow, which did severe damage to his internal organs. If there was any time to take advantage of Kylo, now would be the time. But it was more evident than ever that he was currently on the hunt. He was instructed by his master, Snoke, to bring the girl back to him. As the snow continued to fall, and the distant battle could be heard raging on in the distance, Finn and Rey jumped back as Kylo rounded a tree without his mask on and used the Force to throw Rey across the forest, slamming her into a tree and knocking her out. Finn ran away from Kylo to check on Rey, as a crimson-wielding Kylo tauntingly walked behind him. Finn got down to Rey and checked on her. She was still unconscious, and then from behind Finn cried out the raging call of the name Traitor. Finn's face scrunched up as he heard the name Traitor referred to him several times since he left the First Order, which was only a mere couple days before. It was his decision, and he believed it to be the right decision. Finn turned around and looked at the person he used to refer to as Sir. This used to be his boss, and now he was going to face him down. Finn pulled the weapon from his belt and ignited the pure blue blade of Anakin Skywalker. Ren didn't like this much at all, as he told Finn that that blade belonged to him. The former stormtrooper tauntingly told Kylo to come and get it from him. The former Jedi swung forward with his red crossguard, smacking blades with Finn. Luckily for Finn, stormtrooper training within the First Order allowed him to gain knowledge of combat with a blade. Finn and Kylo interlocked in a blade as a superior duelist used all of his strength with a lightsaber to push Finn back. Finn swung forward to try and parry Kylo, but he was met with a shove and a swing back. Finn tumbled as Ren pushed his advantage against the former stormtrooper. Finn was shoved up against a tree as Kylo used the edge of his crossblade to cut into Finn's shoulder. Finn began to cry out, screaming in pain, awakening Rey as she looked up over to see nothing but blurriness. Finn pushed Kylo off and dragged the blade of Skywalker around and slashed at Kylo, cutting into his shoulder, upsetting the wannabe Sith Lord even more. Kylo turned around after wilting in pain for a moment, as he threw his fist into Finn's jaw, throwing Finn off of balance. Kylo then turned Finn around and dragged his blade up the middle of Finn's back. Finn yelled out in pain as he dropped to the ground unconscious. Rey looked over at Finn and saw that he was down as she looked at Kylo. He reached out with the Force to try and pull the lightsaber from the snow, though he seemed to be struggling. Rey reached out her hand, trying to pull the blade of Anakin Skywalker so that she may defend herself from Kylo Ren. The lightsaber was locked in gridlock as the hilt juggled in the snow. Kylo frowned as he pushed his hand out more, trying to call the blade of his grandfather to him. As he pulled the blade, it whipped past his head and past Rey as she and Kylo turned around to see Jedi Master Luke Skywalker. Luke looked down at his father's blade and pulled out his own blade as he ignited both the green and blue lightsabers. Kylo stuttered back as he looked at his former master. Luke told Ren that he was disrespecting his grandfather's legacy by trying to wield his blade. Kylo rebutted by telling Luke that it was the same blade that slaughtered younglings and the Jedi during the First Purge. Luke stepped forward into the snow, getting closer to Kylo, as he told him that might be so, But it will never defy what Anakin did to conquer his own demons and come full circle within the Force to become the Chosen One. Kylo yelled out, telling Luke that he needed to stop living in the past, acting like anything Anakin did was more grandeur than the accomplishments of Vader. Luke looked in horror. Since the night he lost Kylo, he thought that maybe there would be redemption within him, but it seemed that was not the case. Kylo Ren was not Ben Solo, because Ben would never be so vile. Ben used to love hearing about Anakin and his stories, especially when Ahsoka visited the temple from time to time, but now Ben hated the idea of Skywalker. Luke pulled the two blades around into his form position as he looked at Kylo and told him that it was time to stop living in the dreams of the Sith. Kylo stepped forward, getting angrier by each step, telling Luke that he'd become more powerful because of his allegiance to Snoke and to the dark side. Luke couldn't believe what he was hearing, as he told Kylo that he was imagining it. This self-proclaimed power never lasted. The Sith waited over a millennia to have power, and Palpatine lost that power less than 25 years after gaining it. Not to mention, the generations of Sith would grow into power and then lose it. Kylo wasn't even alive during the short reign the Sith had in generations. Now he wanted to throw everything away to have a chance at a fever dream only one of thousands of Sith could ever accomplish. Sure, it was in his blood to be able to achieve it, but was it really possible? Kylo was nothing like Anakin Skywalker. Luke frowned after seeing how Kylo had fallen so low and apologized for everything. Kylo growled as he leapt forward, having heard enough of these apologies. Han Solo had failed him as a father and Luke had failed him as a master. Now Kylo wanted to cut off the loose ends and kill both Han and Luke in the same night, doing what Snoke thought he couldn't do. Kylo swung down as Luke twisted back and blocked his father's blade, and then swung his blade forward, clashing with Kylo as he teetered back. A little to the right, Rey ran over to make sure that Finn was okay. Luckily, he wasn't bleeding, but his back had a massive cut straight down the middle. Rey worried if Finn would ever be able to walk again. Rey then heard heavy footsteps as she looked over to see the Wookiee warrior Chewbacca coming to help Finn off of the snow. Luke heard the growl and didn't have to look over as he pushed Kylo back. Ren screamed out in his anger as he tried his hardest to keep up, but Luke shoved him back further and further. Luke was masterful as a Jedi, and Kylo was far from masterful yet. The ground began to crack as Ren tumbled backwards, looking at Luke as a valley formed between the former master and student. Luke didn't have time to worry about Ren as he turned around to see Chewbacca carrying Finn back to the Falcon. Luke looked at Rey as he sheathed his blades and told her to follow Chewie into the Falcon. He'd be right behind them. R2 whistled from the astromech spot on Luke's personal X-Wing. The Millennium Falcon and Luke's Red 5 lifted off of the ground and took off as both starships fled the system. On the other side of the Force, Poe Dameron and the rest of the Resistance Force were able to blow a hole into the exhaust port and create an explosion of Starkiller Base. The Resistance fighters fled, all getting in line behind the Millennium Falcon and Red 5, as all the starships jumped into hyperspace back to the planet they all launched their assault from. The planet they returned to was Dakar. When they eventually landed on the world, Luke was the first one to greet his sister, as he apologized for what happened to Han, and what happened to Kylo. The brother and sister wrapped their arms around each other and gave each other a tight hug. Chewie carried Finn out to a small medical capsule as the Resistance members took Finn to the medical bay. Rey followed closely behind to make sure her new friend was okay. She held his hand as she followed closely with the Resistance members that were taking care of Finn. Luke and Leia were still outside of the Falcon, talking as Leia asked where he'd been. Luke admitted that he had been gone looking for answers. Luke said that he failed as a Grand Master, much like Yoda had, but instead of going into exile like Yoda did, he searched for answers. Leia looked at her brother and told him that it was because he gave up on one thing that he separated himself from the Jedi Order from before. Luke looked at his sister with a puzzled expression. Leia asked Luke what helped him bring their father back to the light. Luke said it was love, compassion, trust, and dedication. Leia nodded her head, telling her brother that it was the first one, love. Luke paused for a moment and thought back. He realized that in all of his attempts to study the Jedi Order before him, he undid everything, every very thing that made him stand unique amongst the former Jedi Order, and the sole reason that helped him fight the adversity of the dark side and bring Vader back to the light. Luke stood silent for a moment. Leia put her arm around her brother and told him that it wasn't anything to fret about. Yes, it was a failure, but Leia knew just as well as anyone else within the former rebellion that failure could teach more than success ever could. While it was a shame that the Jedi had to die for Luke's failure, it was Luke's failure that could save the Jedi ways. Luke could do it again with 2 new students and teach them that it was okay to have love and to care for others without disrupting some ancient code. Leia looked at her brother and told him that he was too interested in what was rather than what would be. Luke smiled at his sister. She reminded him of his little green teacher. Luke thought for a moment as he told Leia he'd try again. He'd rebuild again. And unlike Yoda, he wouldn't go into exile. Leia smiled as she asked what he was really doing for so long. Luke told his sister that he visited every Jedi temple that was left behind, other than the one that was on Ilum. He went into each temple to understand more about the failures of the past and why they happened, or how they happened. Some had to do with systematic failure, others because of Sith, and some, like Yoda's, because of his own arrogance. The Jedi had continued to fail because they continued to forget the most important aspects of the Force. Luke learned so much, but he couldn't figure out why they lasted for so long compared to the Sith. Leia thought that Luke was just being silly. He was overanalyzing everything about the Jedi Order. He was overlooking what their impact on the galaxy was and the hope that they gave. She told Luke to remember what Obi-Wan told him. Luke smiled. Old Obi-Wan Kenobi. Both Luke and Leia had their fond memories of the old Jedi Master. Luke needed to just trust in the Force, and he hadn't been doing that. As a Grand Master of the Jedi Order, he lost sight of the most important values he held near and dear from the first time he became a master with Grogu. Leia and Han never blamed Luke for what happened to Ben, but Luke also needed to stop blaming himself for what happened to Ben. Luke told Leia that her son was too far gone. Leia looked at Luke and told him that no one was ever really gone. Luke smiled as he looked down at his father's blade. Leia smiled and Luke smiled back. Inside of the base, Rey sat next to the medical capsule that held Finn. The medics were filling the capsule with Bacta as a means to help Finn's back recover. The medics told Rey that Finn would be okay, but he needed to stay in stasis for a little while. They didn't know when or how long it would take for him to wake up, but she could stay if she wanted, but she didn't have to. For now, it was all a matter of time. Rey nodded her head and fixed a couple of boxes together and sat down. Rey heard footsteps and looked to her right to see Luke walking into the medical room. He asked if Finn was okay. Rey stuttered over her words. She still couldn't believe she was standing in the presence of Luke Skywalker. He was a hero of the rebellion. Luke smiled and told Rey that the two of them had a lot of potential within the Force. Rey looked back at Luke and questioned him. Luke smiled and said that she and Finn had the potential for greatness. Rey smiled a little weakly, and she didn't really know how to feel about this offer. In all honesty, it was a lot to take in. Luke told Rey that she didn't need to have her answer ready at any particular time. It was just him wondering if she would think about becoming a Jedi. Luke told her that he was going to rebuild a new Jedi Order on a new Jedi Code, and he needed new students willing to learn. Rey smiled and told Luke that she would consider his offer. Luke nodded and walked out of the room. This behavior from Luke was inspired by his twin sister. Leia always brought the best out of people. She did it when she was a child with Obi-Wan, and she did it as a leader of the rebellion, helping the Ghost crew in the early days of the war, and leading assaults when the war was ending. Leia had a great gift, and she continued to use it to help her brother out. Luke should have come to her when his order was first destroyed, but he didn't really think about it. Everything seemed to come full circle though, and that was perfectly okay. Moments later, an alarm began to sound within the base. Luke looked around trying to find his sister, trying to ask what happened. Though, from the panic of the troops in the base, it was clearly the First Order. The base began packing up. The Resistance was very fragile, and this was one of very few Resistance cells left in the galaxy. Other than the New Republic that was mostly destroyed in the Hosnian system, Leia knew that this band of rebels needed to stick together. There were 3 cruisers in orbit of the planet. One of them was Admiral Akbar's new flagship at the moment, called the Raddus, named after the legendary admiral from the Battle of Scarif. Regardless, the Resistance had to pack up and go immediately. The base was on high alert. Rey got a hold of Finn's capsule and helped load it into one of the transport vessels. Poe Dameron and the rest of the Resistance fighter group hopped into their X-Wings and Y-Wings and prepared for combat. Their only mission was to protect the fleet. It seemed as if some TIE fighters came out of hyperspace with the intention of stalling the Resistance. Outside of Jakar, a space battle ensued. Only a dogfight, but it was enough to get Luke to hop into his X-Wing and aid the Resistance fighters. Luke was prepared as he and Poe led the counteroffensive against the First Order. These pilots were very similar to Imperial pilots. The only benefit First Order TIE fighters had is that they had rear cannons that could create havoc for bad pilots. But considering the Resistance pilots just took down Starkiller Base, this was the best the Resistance had to offer, especially with Luke and Poe in their corner. The Resistance fighters were able to successfully take the fight to the First Order as the pilots and TIE fighters struggled to hold their own against the Resistance. This bought enough time for the rebels on the ground to get their supplies into the star cruisers above. The final shipments off the ground were able to escape the surface as 2 Resurgent-class Star Destroyers and 1 Dreadnought entered hyperspace. The Dreadnought was equipped with a massive cannon beneath its hull, and it unloaded a massive round into the surface of the former and newly abandoned Resistance base. Poe and Luke finished up the fight against the TIE fighters as Leia requested all ships to the hangar bay. Poe tried to defy orders, but on his way to face down the Dreadnought, Luke buzzed him by flying right over top of him, telling him that this was not the fight he wanted to pick. The resources would serve them better if they escaped now, rather than fight the First Order fleet here. Poe barreled back around, and with Luke right behind him, they pulled into the hangar bays of the Star Cruisers, as Luke caught up to the deck, and within moments, the Resistance fleet was in hyperspace. While in hyperspace, Luke and Poe exited their starfighters as Luke walked over to Poe. R2-D2 and BB-8 made their way into the interior of the ship, while Luke talked to Poe about what he did. Luke scolded Poe for being so ignorant enough to do what he did. Poe looked at Luke and bit his lip. He could say something back to Luke. Luke continued telling Poe that this was the most important part of leadership, was making sure that your troops were safe, not throwing them into an unsafe situation that can cause them to die. Poe put his finger on Luke's chest and then asked him to elaborate on why he spent the last several days looking for a map leading to him, when he was the one who left his order to die. Luke looked down at Poe's finger, and then back to the man that stood in front of him, as he threw back the words telling Poe that at least he was able to learn from his own mistakes. The mistakes Poe almost caused would have cost the Resistance a battle in the future, or the defense of its only flagship in the Resistance's arsenal. Maybe if Poe could get through his head that there were more important battles to win, he would accomplish a simple task of keeping the Resistance fighting another day. Poe stuttered for a moment, and before he could speak, Luke told him to think about what he had done, and what had to be won, and what didn't. Luke expressed that the battle over Yavin needed to be won, but the battle over Dakar was a revenge mission focused on a personal vendetta. It would be wise to remember the difference. Luke turned away from Poe as he stood next to his X-Wing silently. Luke was genuinely annoyed. If he had ever pulled that maneuver during the days of the rebellion, Mothma or Leia would have torn him apart. Luke turned the corner and headed towards the medical facility. Finn had gotten all hooked up, and Rey was sleeping by his side in a small chair. It wasn't comfortable, but after all the difficulties of the last few days and the lack of sleep she got, it was completely reasonable to understand why she was sleeping. Luke walked into the room and looked at Finn, and then over to Rey. He saw that she was sleeping next to him and then walked back out of the room, after seeing that Finn's heart monitor was doing well. Luke turned back and started walking back to the bridge. Luke started talking to Leia once he got there and asked what the plan was. Leia said that they were going to emerge from hyperspace near a former rebel base, but the new plan was to continue through space with the hopes of grouping up with some remnants of the New Republic. Leia noted that Admiral Ackbar had been reaching out to planets across the galaxy, trying to see which fleets were still available. Luke asked if Ackbar was able to come back with anything. Leia admitted that he hadn't, but with the fall of the Hosnian system, there was a good chance that the New Republic was blocking any transmissions from deep space, even if it was a Resistance. As far as the New Republic was concerned, everyone was an enemy, and the First Order was more of a threat than they originally thought. The Resistance was all alone as of right now. Luke looked out of the bridge window as hyperspace came to an end and the ship began to creak and shake after coming out of hyperspace. Leia continued forward and looked ahead. All was good, and then within seconds, alarms began to sound as one of the deckhands yelled out that there was a proximity alert. Ackbar looked over and told them to turn on the holotable, and within a second, the Supremacy and part of the First Order fleet arrived at hyperspace. Admiral Ackbar jumped and demanded the entire fleet prep its rear shields and get ready to jump to hyperspace. Leia told the deck to stop. Luke continued off of what his twin said by mentioning that the First Order had most likely followed them and tracked them through hyperspace. Luke told Ackbar that they needed to push the engines and move forward. The Resistance ships were much lighter than the capital ships the First Order had. Luke yelled across as Ackbar gave out orders and prepared the engines to move forward at full thrust. Luke told the deckhands to call out to Mon Calamari, Kuat in Corellia to see if there were any available New Republic fleets that could get here in time. Leia told another deckhand to try other planets in the near area, like Dantooine, Lothal, and Hypori. Everything in the bridge was at high alert. The Raddus and the support ships next to it boosted forward as they moved to avoid the supremacy. Luke then turned around and spoke through the comms, telling every starfighter to get out of the ship and defend the vessel. Leia looked at Luke, as he said that Kylo would be coming out to cause as much damage as he could. Leia nodded her head as Luke made his way out of the room. Poe entered his X-Wing and several other rebel fighters entered their own respective starfighters, and abandoned the hangar bay as they all prepared to defend the fleet. Luke made his way to the hangar bay as he hopped in Red 5 and left the hangar bay. Luke barreled out of the hangar bay and saw 3 wings of TIE fighters heading towards him, and in front of him was Kylo Ren. He could tell Kylo was so inspired by his grandfather, but Luke knew himself that Kylo would never be edgy enough to be Vader. As long as Kylo didn't focus on becoming himself, he wouldn't be a threat. He'd only be trying to be something that he couldn't be. But if Kylo turned around and tried to make his own legacy, then he would become a true threat. Luke pulled his X-Wing to the side and told the wing of A-Wings to spread out and split over to the port and starboard sides, while the bulk of fighters, which were all X-Wings, shot down the middle. Poe and the rest of the X-Wings lined up behind Red 5 as they began to lead a defense of the Raddus and its supporting ships. A massive dogfight began, as the pilots of both the Resistance and the First Order got into combat. The Supremacy and the massive First Order fleet moved closer and closer as the Resistance tried to distance itself from them. The dogfight intensified, as Luke and Kylo got into an intense dogfight themselves. The duel between age and ego. Luke whipped his aging X-Wing over the hull of the Raddus as Kylo pushed his TIE Advanced as hard as he could, revving the engine as hard as possible, trying to take down his old teacher. Kylo's blood boiled, and then he felt the presence of his mother. Maybe there was really good left in him, but he tried to push it all away as he slammed down on the trigger as he shot his TIE blasters out into space, all narrowly missing Luke. Something for sure was true, and it was the fact that these Skywalkers were incredible pilots. Luke flipped his X-Wing back and then ripped his handbrake at the bottom of the cockpit as he pulled the gear around to the right as he faced Kylo and blasted away. Kylo yelled out as he whipped his starfighter to the left, but it was too late. One of the wings was clipped down the line and his starfighter began to spin out of control, back towards the Supremacy. Luke pulled back around so he could finish what he created, but there were TIE fighters covering Kylo's escape. The dogfight ended with minimal Resistance casualties, as the First Order pulled back half of one of 3 TIE fighter squadrons back to the Supremacy. The Resistance fighters pulled back into the hangar bay. They all got their ships landed and exited their starfighters. Inside of the medical bay, Finn jolted up from his sleep as he yelled the name Rey. Rey was still sleeping next to him and then jumped up as she saw Finn awake, and heard her name too. Finn rolled himself over and looked at her with his head. He smiled and asked if she was okay. Rey grinned and told him that she was perfectly fine, but she was very curious to know how he was feeling. Finn looked around and said he wasn't really sure, he couldn't feel much. Rey moved her seat over next to him and grabbed a hold of his hand and told him that he was in a bacta suit. Finn acknowledged it as he looked over and looked at Rey and asked what happened. Rey exclaimed to Finn that Luke showed up right after Kylo hurt him and defended the two of them. Chewie took Finn to the Falcon and the Resistance was able to blow up Starkiller Base. But the First Order came back to the car and the Resistance had to evacuate. Now they were seemingly tracked through hyperspace and currently on the run. Finn sighed. He told Rey that the First Order had developed the technology, he just didn't get a chance to tell anyone about that technology. Rey told Finn not to worry about it. Everything seemed to be alright from what she had heard. Rey hadn't actually heard anything. She was asleep. She just was trying to keep Finn calm. Ever since he woke her, his heart monitor was spiking, so she was doing her best to keep him calm and keep his heart rate down, as she rubbed his hand with her hands. The door shot open as Luke walked in. Rey and Finn looked over to Luke and asked if everything was alright. Luke nodded his head as he asked if the two of them were doing alright. Finn nodded his head, and Luke walked up to the monitors next to Finn's bed, on the opposite side from Rey. As he looked at all the data, everything looked to be good. It seemed as if Finn would be able to walk within a couple of hours. Luke asked if the two of them would like to participate in the beginning of the new Jedi Order. Finn looked at Rey, and then back to Luke. The Jedi Master noticed this and thought for a moment. He realized that things may have to be different with the first 2 students in this new order. Nothing for sure yet, but a possibility of it. Luke then told the two of them that they had time to decide. They didn't need to answer just yet, but Luke continued as he told them that they were both very powerful with the Force, as he said that he would have to guess both likely had a midichlorian count to the average Jedi Council member in the days of the Republic. Rey looked back at Finn, and then back to Luke, telling him that they would think about his offer. Luke bowed to the two of them and left the room as he headed back for the bridge of the Star Cruiser. Inside the medical room, Rey asked Finn what his thoughts were on the topic. Finn thought about it. It would be a great opportunity, but he would only do it if she did it with him. Rey smiled and then looked down at the floor as she thought about the implications of doing such. It could be a great opportunity for the both of them to learn about the Force and expand their knowledge on what they barely knew anything about. Rey told Finn that she would be willing to do it with him. Moments later, Luke entered the bridge as Leia turned around with excitement on her face. Luke asked her what the news was, as she admitted that the New Republic fleet was heading towards their location. It had the only New Republic Super Star Dreadnought in the Alliance fleet. Luke asked if it was a remodified Super Star Destroyer the Alliance captured. Leia nodded her head. The ship was stolen from the Empire before the Battle of Jakku, and it was remodified to serve the Alliance, and then the New Republic against the Remnant, though it was almost decommissioned after the New Republic put a hold on the production of all warships. Luckily, the Queen of Mon Cala requested that the vehicle be placed in their care for the time being, considering the Imperial Remnant liked to frequently raid the capital ship production yards at Mon Cala. It was approved by the New Republic, and it was still there up until the Hosnian system was destroyed. Luckily, Akbar still had some of the old Alliance codes used to get through to contacts on Mon Cala, which enabled him to request the largest New Republic fleet the galaxy had at the moment. It would take about an hour or so until they got there, but it would be the perfect escape for the Resistance. Inside of the Supremacy, Kylo Ren exited his broken starfighter and marched his way up to the throne room of his master. Kylo got into a lift as it took him up to his master's throne room. When the door opened, Kylo walked forward and stood before Snoke himself. Snoke growled. He was very disappointed in Kylo for losing to Skywalker twice. Snoke admitted he was glad to see that Skywalker came out of retirement to face him down, but it was a shame that he'd never have the chance because the Resistance fleet would be blown out of the sky by the First Order. Kylo knelt silently, while his master spoke at him. Though after Snoke monologued for a bit about the downfall of the Jedi and the Resistance, he turned his attention to Kylo. Snoke called out Kylo for his failures. He told Kylo that he was nothing more than a child in a mask. When Kylo stood up to stand up for himself, a wave of electricity bounced off the floor and covered him as he fell to the ground in agony. Kylo looked at Snoke with anger on his face as Snoke told Kylo that he would never live up to the image of Darth Vader, and until he got that out of his mind, he would always stand in the shadow of someone leagues more powerful than he. Ren looked at Snoke as he mocked Kylo by standing up. Snoke told Kylo to do it, to ignite his fiery lightsaber and strike him down. Kylo didn't bat an eye as he looked into Snoke's eyes. The Master of Evil stepped forward, inching himself closer to Kylo Ren. Ren did not back down. He stared into the face of evil and straightened his posture. He was not afraid of this monster. He didn't fear the punishment to come from this. Instead, he welcomed the opportunity to do what Vader could not, because what Snoke said was true. Vader was only the apprentice, so Kylo was going to become the Master and the Supreme Leader. Snoke watched Kylo hover his hand over his lightsaber, and then he moved his hand away as he stared at Snoke. The two of them started to encircle the invisible line on the floor, as their eyes never left each other. Snoke raised his hand and realized he couldn't move Kylo, because all along Kylo was waiting for this moment. He stepped forward and Snoke was completely caught off guard by the moment. Snoke tried to shoot lightning through the floor at Kylo, but he danced around it like he saw it before it even happened. Snoke watched Kylo move in closer, realizing that this was the true heir to Vader's throne. Snoke stepped back and called out his guards to help him, as Kylo grinned, and then from his side he threw his weapon at Snoke. The Master of Evil tried to stop it, but before he could defend himself, the blade shot through his chest, and the last thing that Snoke ever saw were the boots of Kylo Ren walking towards him. Kylo, instead of fighting the guards, told them that he was their new master. If they didn't obey him, then they would die in a similar fashion. Kylo had everything planned out. He wanted Starkiller Base to be a failure of the Supreme Leader, because if Snoke failed, then he was no longer necessary to the First Order, or the mission they intended to complete in the galaxy. The First Order needed to be effective at every turn, and Snoke was just a part of Kylo's plans. Seriously, another Death Star, but bigger than the first and bigger than the second? Kylo knew it would fail, and instead of falling for it, he allowed Snoke to fail so that he could take his place. Kylo knew that the First Order would rally around a strong leader, not a weak one who failed to do something that Emperor Palpatine could not. The guards all looked at each other, and they didn't know what to do. But they all knelt before Kylo as they submitted their loyalty to him. He was their supreme leader now, and there was no going around that. They needed to follow him and his will and his vision alone. The admirals, the generals, and everyone else inside of the First Order now worked for Kylo Ren, and for the first time, they would not fail. Kylo turned around and walked towards the lift as the 6 guards motioned behind him and left the throne room with him. Snoke's body was left behind in the throne room he used to helm. When the lift reached its level, Kylo stormed out without his helmet. He played the part he wanted to play, and everyone bought it. Now he was going to be himself, Kylo Ren, heir to the throne of the First Order and supreme leader of their movement against the New Republic. Kylo knew the best time to strike was when both good guys and the bad guys were weak, just like Emperor Palpatine did during the Clone Wars. Kylo was going to establish his own legacy and his own rule over the galaxy, and after the Resistance was crushed, he would move to the former capital of the galaxy and place his throne on Coruscant. But first, he and his new guard marched to the bridge where Admiral Hux awaited, overseeing the attack of the Resistance. Hux immediately noticed that Snoke's guard was following Kylo. Assuming that Kylo betrayed Snoke, he begged the question. Kylo, unlike the Empire, unlike Sidious, and unlike Snoke, would not stand for inept leaders. Kylo looked over at the waste man standing next to him and snapped Hux's neck as he turned to face the bridge. Kylo turned over to the next highest ranked individual on deck, Captain Peavy, and told him that he was now the officer on deck of the ship. The officer saluted and demanded that someone dispose of the trash left in the room. He turned his attention to the Resistance fleet as Kylo told Peavy to move the fleet into attack position. Peavy called out 2 star cruisers on the right and the left flank and demanded that they jump into hyperspace just a little ahead of the Resistance fleet, and then they'd be able to blockade them against the supremacy. Kylo smiled, and while he wouldn't be able to personally kill the last Jedi, he knew that the death of the Jedi would be under his orders, and that was more than enough for him. The 2 resurgent Star Destroyers jumped forward and immediately, when they exited hyperspace, turned their heavy cannons to face the Raddus. It was a brilliant move, but Ackbar expected it. He assumed the First Order would move their fleet around to blockade the Resistance, but he didn't think it would take him as long as it did. Ackbar demanded that the forward shields be raised, and that the 2 transports following behind them line up behind the Raddus with the port or starboard shields raised to maximum power. The Raddus raised its port and starboard shields as it took a massive beating from both sides. The entire ship began to rock from side to side as the Resistance members inside began to panic. Ackbar told everyone to steady the course. At the moment, to everyone, it looked as if it was going to be the end of the Resistance. It looked as if everything would come crashing down on the Resistance, and their fleet would fall apart and the dream of peace would die with them. Moments later, an Imperial-era Super Star Destroyer exited hyperspace with an array of Mon Calamari cruisers, some of them winged MC-80s, 1 or 2 MC-75s, and several of the New Republic modified cruisers that were armed with more weapons and heavier shields. The New Republic models were built for the Imperial Remnant and the return of Thrawn, which was silenced by the New Republic fleets. Kylo yelled out to blow these pieces of junk out of the sky. Captain Peary demanded that the entire First Order fleet prepare for combat. Though because the Resurgence-class Star Destroyers near the Raddus didn't expect the party, their hulls crumbled under the amount of firepower released by the New Republic fleet. Ackbar smiled as he ordered the support ships to continue moving behind the lines on the New Republic, as he demanded that the Raddus turn around to face the supremacy. The Admiral of the New Republic fleet that was stationed over Mon Cala was actually the grandson of Admiral Raddus, and he told all vessels to move forward into attack formation Beta, which was in coalition with what Admiral Ackbar used during the Battle of Endor. The young Raddus was cunning just like his grandfather, and was ready to play by Ackbar's rules. The supremacy was loaded for a frontal assault, though the only issue is that their shields were not primed for combat. The New Republic unloaded everything it had as the First Order felt the brunt of the attack. Ackbar ordered all pilots out to their ships and prepare for an assault. All fighters go for their X-Wings, A-Wings, and B-Wings. Following them would be Y-Wings to provide support for the heaviest bombers in the New Republic fleet, the MG-100 Star Fortress SF-17s, or simply the SF-17s. These bombers were used very strategically, and if they weren't ordered by the proper leader, then it could result in heavy casualties. Ackbar knew where to place these massive bombers. He also ensured that these bombers kept a wide formation to avoid catastrophe. The New Republic bounced back from what it seemed to be the ultimate defeat, as the Resistance and New Republic fleets mounted up the perfect master flank. The First Order was not prepared, and then, when all the fighters came at them, Captain Peary panicked as he ordered every single TIE fighter wing out of every single hangar bay and into combat. Kylo looked over and watched as the Supremacy's hull began to flicker. It was getting damaged very heavily by the former Super Star Destroyer. Kylo knew that the supremacy was built by Snoke to look threatening, but in reality, the First Order lacked the productivity that the Empire came by so easily. The supremacy, while decades newer than the New Republic SSD, was much weaker and certainly less armed. It didn't have the shields to compete either. The only benefit the supremacy had was a row of 4 mortar cannons, the same ones that they'd been using to bombard the Raddus until the New Republic arrived. There was also another thing about the Super Star Destroyer. It was angled perfectly. All the cannons on the ship could hit the supremacy, while not all the cannons on the supremacy could hit the Super Star Destroyer. The 2 Star Destroyers next to the Raddus tumbled apart as the Resistance moved into attack position. Leia stood on the bridge watching everything unfold before her. Last time a battle was this big, Luke was watching from the side, and now he was in his starfighter, side by side with Poe Dameron, as they moved into attack position. The Resistance fighters came up on their assault on the First Order, as the First Order played catch-up. Captain Peavy, while elder, and having served the Empire, didn't have the experience as the same admiral who single-handedly took down the morale from the Empire during the Battle of Endor. Akbar was very experienced, and his experience went all the way back to the Clone Wars. Everything was ready. The First Order was clocked in for another loss, as one of the Star Destroyers crumbled in space next to the Supremacy. Luke led wings of A-Wings across the starboard flank of the First Order line, while Poe and his X-Wings led one across the port side. The B-Wings made a beeline down the middle of the flank, with the Millennium Falcon providing cover fire, and the Y-Wings and SF-17s following behind. B-Wings were great in fighter-on-fighter combat, but they were also excellent bombers. The Supremacy also had another issue. Much like a traditional ISD, it was only stocked with heavy cannons, meant for ship-on-ship combat, not for anti-fighter capabilities. Kylo growled as he demanded to know where the TIE fighters were. Captain Perry said that they were currently being held up by both flanks of A-Wings and X-Wings. Kylo looked over at the battle map on the hologram in the middle of the room as he saw another one of his Star Destroyers get dropped out of the sky. The SF-17s were approaching, and without TIE fighters to take them down, there was a very good chance that the Supremacy would be ripped in half by the amount of bombs these bombers were capable of dropping on any given location. Kylo turned around to Peary and ordered him to have the fleet retreat to the core. Peary tried to rebuttal by saying that the core was where the New Republic was strongest. Kylo said that not everywhere in the core was exactly fond of the New Republic. Captain Peary demanded the fleet retreat, as he also ordered the closest Resurgent-class Star Destroyer to move to the bow of the Supremacy. The ship moved as ordered while the Supremacy turned its massive hull around. Captain Peary redirected the shields as the ship moved. Another Resurgence got destroyed as the New Republic crept in on the First Order. Kylo looked out the window to see the Resurgence that moved up to the bow of the Supremacy also get destroyed, but not by the capital ships. Instead, it was destroyed by B-Wings, Y-Wings, and the SF-17s. The First Order then immediately left into hyperspace as the remaining TIE fighters were shot out of the sky without any chance for mercy. The only reason is when someone blows an entire star system out of the sky, there is no penance, only pain. The New Republic was not going to make the same mistake a second time. The Resistance fighters made their way back to the hangar bays of their ships as Admiral Akbar and Raddus II began talks of strategy on moving forward. The scene had changed so much over the years, and especially after Mon Mothma passed away. But the agenda was always the same: find peace and restore justice into the galaxy. No one knew where the First Order was heading anymore. On the other hand, Luke didn't go to the bridge. Instead, he made his way down into the medical room where Rey was helping Finn stand on his own for the first time. They were holding on to each other, and it was obvious that the connection they had within the first couple of days they first met was very strong. Rey was very careful with Finn as he regained some of his composure and some of his strength. Luke walked into the door as Rey and Finn looked at him. Luke smiled and then asked them on their thoughts on moving forward. Both Rey and Finn looked into each other's eyes. There was a certain glimmer between the two of them, and their smile glowed like stardust. The two of them looked back towards Luke and told him that they would like to be Jedi as well. Luke smiled as he told them that they could leave when they were ready. Finn looked at Rey and shook his head as if to say that he was ready now. Luke saw this and asked if he was for sure. Finn smiled. Luke grinned and then told the two of them to pack warm. They'd be leaving in 10. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of part 1, we will be back with part 2 soon. Special thanks to Benjamin Wells, Icy Raptor, Anakin003, and Gort for supporting the channel as patrons. If you want to see what if, let me know below. I've got console Duel crossovers. Check out the Twitch community Discord and Patreon for supporting me in other ways. The link for the lightsaber giveaway is down below. You just go down below and you go into the dock. You click on the dock and you write your name on the dock. I give away lightsabers for 50,000 subscribers, and winners will be announced in the video. I know this part 1 didn't have a lot of John Boyega in it or Finn in it. That is a point. I had to set up the story first. This is a very big setup. I'm really excited for what I'm going to bring for you in part 2, so stay tuned. I'm not sure when part 2 is going to come out yet. Maybe Tuesday will be a good idea for a scheduled upload for that, but keep your eyes out for part 2. I got a huge weekend for you guys coming out. We got our first animation coming out this weekend, so stay tuned. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.